object. So, Jeremy, Morgan.
Inizio l'italiano perché è una cosa educata, no? Da parte di British in Italy vorrei ringraziare il comune di Negrar, l'assessore che purtroppo non è qui, e la cantina di Valpolicella, e anche Anne che ha organizzato tutto questo incontro che per noi è molto importante perché l'Italia è un paese lungo, è difficile organizzare i gruppi di britannici in ogni parte del paese e ci vuole qualcuno come Anne con un'idea geniale della pubblicità e anche della solidarietà per bring us together. I just want to start by saying how I completely agree with everything that Stefano has said. One historic connection, I suppose, with what has happened in the past and what is happening now is one of our biggest supporters in the European Parliament is Barbara Spinelli, who was the daughter of the Spinelli who, while incarcerated on the island of Ventotene, dreamt up the idea that actually a unified Europe would be the solution to the wars that were going on at the time. So his forethought and her support indicate the way forward, not the return to the dreadful old ways of before the Second World War. I wanted to start, I'm going to talk about three things really, British in Italy, British in Europe, and the current situation of the negotiations into citizens' rights. I want to start by the two groups just so you understand what they're doing and why they're doing it and who they're doing it for. British in Italy is a group of citizens that came together end of 2016 and beginning of 2017, based in, there are 5 on the committee, in Rome and in Umbria, simply to do something about preserving citizens' rights. To preserve the rights of all of those who've moved either way across the channel seemed to be politically an achievable target, whereas fighting against Brexit is perhaps rather harder to do. So we set ourselves that aim, and we met up with other groups doing similar things throughout Europe. And that is now the coalition of 10 large groups and some smaller ancillary groups, which is called British in Europe. It's a coalition of about 35,000 people who are fighting for the rights of British citizens who, before Brexit, had made the move to Europe. Both groups had 2 cardinal principles from the very beginning, which I think have paid off pretty well. The first was we saw no difference between our rights and the rights of European citizens who'd moved to England. We are all victims of this process. They had no say in the referendum, and about 60% of us, the British in Europe, had no say because of the 15-year-old depriving us of a vote. And we're the ones who are in the teeth of it and who have suffered most clearly as a result. So we saw that as a common objective, and we have always, in pursuance of that objective, worked very closely with the 3 million, which is the analogous group of EU citizens based in the United Kingdom. There's some other groups, but they and we are the only groups that are representative, as opposed to political formations trying to make a point. We've tended to go to major meetings together, and we've tended to present our written responses to various stages of the negotiations in a single document. We don't always, because it's not always possible, but we have tried to do that, and we have demonstrated our solidarity and, if you like, our commitment to the European ideal, which is to work together and not against each other, even though at times our interests have been a little bit different. The other thing we did, the other principle, which I've already kind of hinted at, is we decided not to take on Brexit head-on, not to become just another anti-Brexit group. We do represent the people who are affected, and we think we have got more leverage as a result of being simply we are the people who are affected, rather than we're trying to make a political point, which would not go down well with half of the Tory party, half of the Labour Party in England, and probably would go down all right in the European Parliament. But it seems sensible, and as a result of that we have had extraordinarily high access. If you think that as a group we've been going for about a year, since the first meeting we had with senior figures on either side was a meeting with Michel Barnier the day before Theresa May handed over her letter on the 29th of March last year. That was, I think, quite a publicity coup for him. He got in first. But since then we've met him again, we've met his deputy, he's promised us another meeting. We've had regular meetings with him and even more regular meetings with the civil servants involved in the Brexit negotiation on the EU side, as well as the Parliament, as well as the Council. The Council is the 27 countries, their representatives, and the ambassadors to Brussels of each of those countries. On the British side, we have not met David Davis, kind of consistently, hasn't shown a lot of interest in the rights of British citizens. We've met a couple of junior ministers rather briefly, but they've both moved on to other jobs. What we have had is regular access to the top civil servants, the ones in charge of the negotiation over citizens' rights. To give you an example, last year there were, you may recall, a round of negotiations every month from about June to December. We had debriefs on both sides, either physically or over the telephone, before and after each round of negotiations. And after each round of negotiations, we put in written comments on the latest developments and the issues that seem to us still to be alive. This year, the process has been rather less organised. We have had regular meetings with them, but they tend to be kind of ad hoc when it seems to be the case that something needs to be addressed quite quickly, like last week, or this week actually, on Wednesday, the European Union's draft withdrawal agreement was produced. So that's the process. At the same time, we've lobbied a lot. Lobbying, I think, we've given evidence, let's say, to the, in England we've given evidence to the House of Commons exiting the EU committee, to the House of Lords committee dealing with citizens' rights. In Europe, we've given evidence to the European Parliament, and we've given evidence to the Constitutional Committee of the European Parliament. We've spoken to a lot of MEPs and a lot of MPs, and we've tried to get them to see the importance of the situation. I think it would be fair to say that the plight of EU citizens in the UK has struck a greater chord than the plight of British citizens in Europe. For some reason we're seen as less important and less to be worried about. I'll go on in a minute to say whether we need to worry, but I think it's rather sad that effectively the United Kingdom turns its back on people who leave its shores. You can see that very simply in voting rights. We have no rights to vote after 15 years. Italy not only gives its citizens living abroad a vote, it gives them their own MPs and senators. So does France. These are countries that care about their citizens. The United Kingdom, I think, is not. And that is reflected in the amount of support we've got, the amount of sympathy we've got on a lot of issues. I just wanted to say a word about the structure of the two bodies. I don't want to bore you with details of committees and things like that. British in Italy and British in Europe have tended to divide up the tasks that need to be done between them. In fact, all the national groups have done that. Most of the high-level work, the negotiations with London and with Brussels, are done through British in Europe. The work that British in Italy and the other national groups do is focused on the situation in that particular country. So British in Italy, for example, has met quite a lot of Italian politicians, but British in Italy itself hasn't gone off to Brussels. That's been done through the British in Europe group. Very often, of course, the same people are involved, but that's the way the work has been divided up. I've mentioned what British in Europe has achieved in terms of access and publicity. I haven't mentioned British in Italy or what we've done, and I should just do that briefly because we haven't ignored the Italian political scene. We've met with the first responsible official, I suppose, we met with was Sandro Gozzi, who was the Undersecretary for European Affairs at the Presidenza del Consiglio dei Ministri. And so he was the key minister, if you like, in charge of Brexit on Italy's part. We've also met with Marco Piantini, who is Gentilone's consigliere on Brexit, and Pierluigi Delia, who is the Foreign Office representative on the Brexit negotiation. He's the key guy, in fact. We've also given evidence to a committee of the Senate looking into citizens' rights, and we've met privately a number of PD politicians, both senators and representatives in the Cabinet So we've had a lot of meetings, and we've had a lot of support. I think it's fair to say in Italy that the Italians have also been very alive to the fact that they've got a lot of citizens in Britain. There are over 500,000 Italians living in Britain, and therefore they want to look after their interests, and the way of doing that is also to listen to us. So that has played quite well, and we've tended to go to quite a lot of those meetings together with an Italian from the 3 million, or sometimes more than one Italian from the 3 million. We've tried to do it together where we can. The difficulty, of course, in Italy at the moment is the political situation. We might have good relations with the PD, but they're perhaps not going to be quite as useful as they might have been a few months ago. I think our technical connections will carry on being useful for a while at least. We don't know what will happen to them. Someone like Piantini, who was Gentilone's advisor, I suspect won't have a great deal of influence under a new government. Depends what the government is, of course. But the others, I think, will, and Godfrey, of course, is now history. But the others, I think, will still be useful, at least as voices. What will happen is impossible to say in Italy. There are some issues where the views of the Italian government are important beyond the contribution they make to the debate in Brussels. For example, citizenship, which I'll come on to later, is an issue where we may have issues that the Italian government needs to sort out. My take on it is that if we end up with a Cinque Stelle or Lega government, they won't be positively anti-us, they won't be passing special laws to do us down, but equally I think we're unlikely to get special laws passed to help us out in the situation that Brexit leaves. So we'll have to play that by ear, and if anyone's got any views on how to play that, I'd be very interested in hearing those in question time, because it is actually a very, very difficult call to make. Just before I move on to our rights, I want to make a plea for some money. Not for British in Italy, but for British in Europe, who's recently started. We had a bank account for the last 2 months, and we've tried to raise money. And I'll tell you why. All the work that's been done by British in Europe has been done by volunteers who've paid all their expenses out of their own pocket. There have been, I don't know how many, dozens at least, of meetings attended by some of our leading advocates in both in London and in various European capitals. It's not a situation that could go on. The two people who are absolutely key to our success so far have been the chair, Jane Golding, who's a British solicitor, who's a specialist in European competition law, based in Berlin. She is a true European. She qualified in London, took a master's in Paris, went and did a stage at the European Commission, and then worked as a solicitor in Torino for 4 years, in Brussels, and she's now based in Berlin. She has absolutely embraced the European ideal and has been an incredible spokesman for us. You may not know, but if those of you, those lawyers who work in competition law in Europe, have to be not only good lawyers but also good lobbyists, because one of the first things you do if there's a big merger coming up that you're either challenging or supporting, you have to negotiate with the Commission. So she knows her way around the Commission and has been extremely effective at getting meetings at top European level and at being an advocate for us. If you go to the British in Europe website, you will see a very moving a moving speech she made to the Constitutional Affairs Committee of the European Union, which ended up with this, which I think I probably should share with you, which was this. She said, she's married to a German. My father, when he was 20, attended the opening up of Belsen when the Allies arrived there at the end of the Second World War. My father-in-law survived the bombing of Dresden. They, both of them, have been absolutely adamant that we should never go back to those days, and they wanted a different future for their grandchildren. A very personal but absolutely apt statement of the position. She has worked incredibly hard to the point where her practice has been very largely ignored, and that's been going on since about June last year. We decided, if we possibly can, we would like to pay a small fee to her for attending meetings and things, because she has just lost so much money as well. I do actually know how much money she has lost, or not made, and what she's living on at the moment, and it is not enough. And so we desperately need to be able to pay for the huge amount of work that she puts in. The other person in a similar position is Fiona, who is also a trained lawyer, who practiced as a lawyer for a bit in Britain, but ended up as a lobbyist, which is her present job. She works as a lobbyist in the health sector, not for some large pharmaceutical company, but for an organisation that aims to protect people's health. She lives in Luxembourg, is married to a German, works for a Swiss company and runs this Brussels office. You can't get much more European than that. One of her first jobs, when she worked for the European Union, which was a previous job, was to help Russia set up an anti-smoking campaign. So these are people who have dedicated their lives to Europe. More importantly, recently have dedicated a huge amount of time to us, and that's why we're trying to raise some money to certainly cover their expenses, and we'll then end up giving them a small amount of money when they have to go and visit capitals on our behalf. There are others of us who've done quite a lot, probably not as much, I think, as them, but we're not seeking at the moment money for any of us. I certainly don't intend to be paid for any of these things. I'm retired and don't need to make up a missing income. So if you can, the details are on our website, the British and Europe website. If you can put your hands in your pockets and donate, please do. There was a very nice comment on one of the French group's sites, trying to encourage people to contribute. It said this: I saw the 21-page legal submission that was put in response to the agreement that was produced by the European Commission this week. It was of a quality for which I would expect to pay a very large amount of money to expensive lawyers based in London or in a European capital. The least you can do is help contribute to the people who produce material like that. And that was both encouraging and made us feel good, but also perhaps rather a good point. It's high quality work which has produced good results so far and which needs to be funded. Moving on to what you probably came to listen to more, which is the state of the negotiations. Just taking an overview of the negotiations, I think it would be fair to say this, because there are people who think it's all Britain's fault, and there are people who think it's all Europe's fault. We haven't got to an ideal position yet. Clearly it's all Britain's fault in the sense they voted for Brexit, but that's, neither here nor there. That's a given we can't really do anything about, or might not be able to do anything about. But in terms of governance, the European Commission started off backed by the Council group. So this was the European position, was that all our rights, those of us who've moved across the Channel in exercise of our right of freedom movement, should continue to have all those rights. That was their opening shot. And they should all be rights based on European law. And they set out a detailed document with that position spelled out. The British reaction about a month later was to produce a document setting out what they wanted. Normally in a negotiation you expect somebody to make an offer and somebody else to come back and say, well, I can accept this and I can't accept that. That's not the British way. They came back with their own document. It didn't make reference to the European document. It didn't even refer to it. You wouldn't know it existed. They just said, this is what we want. And of course they weren't talking the same language. And the particular thing they wanted was to control immigration. So they wanted a whole new set of British-style immigration rules to keep the hordes at bay as far as they were concerned, and the rest was perhaps rather less important. There were some things which they conceded from the beginning, which they didn't have to concede. I'll give them that. But it set a very bad tone to the negotiations, and the response, in my view, to the British approach was the Europeans then dug in, and they have been quite difficult. At present, I would say that the blame for the impasse we're in on freedom of movement is pretty much 50-50 because of that, the way it worked. Looking at it individually, the main opposition to freedom of movement comes from the Europeans, not from Britain. But that's an overview. I wanted to look at our rights as they are now, as far as we can tell. In terms of procedure, You may recall the negotiations last year were to produce an agreement on citizens' rights as one of the first objects of the negotiation. The question of the future relationship and trade, which of course the British really wanted to talk about, was not to be discussed until the European Union had certified sufficient progress had been made on these other issues, which included Ireland, citizens' rights and the divorce bill. And in December they cobbled together an agreement to suggest we think satisfactory progress has been made and we can move on. And this is the agreement we've got on citizens' rights in outline. So that was the situation. It was a common understanding. The citizens' rights aspect was in some detail, and the next stage was to reduce that to a legally binding agreement, which would have the force of law. And that's the process they've been engaged in since. The British didn't do their draft this time, possibly fortunately. The Commission drafted an agreement. They put it past the various countries, so it has been signed off by the EU 27 countries, and the approved draft was published last Wednesday. The first draft came out at the end of February. And that's the intention, is that should, by and large, reduce into writing the agreement from last December, although the Europeans threw in a few little extras of their own because they wanted to make sure that everything was discussed. One of the extras of their own was something that had not been agreed last December. In other words, it had been positively disagreed about. And the other thing that they threw in was something which they had promised would be discussed later and hasn't been. And that's the important one for freedom of movement. Where does all of this leave us as individuals affected by these negotiations? Whether we are British citizens living in Europe or Europeans living in the United Kingdom. It may well be that some of you Italians here have relatives living in the United Kingdom and you want to know their position. The first point is this. None of us can completely sleep at night because the European Union laid down from the very beginning an overriding principle which was nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And by that they didn't mean we have to have a deal on citizens' rights, they meant we have to have a deal on everything, which is to be discussed under Article 50. So unless there is an agreement on the divorce bill, on Ireland, on citizens' rights, and on various other matters which have to be sorted out, then, as far as they are concerned, there is no deal. In December, the British added a little rider to that, just to make life a little more difficult, which was also, if we don't agree at least the framework of a trade arrangement for the future, there will be no deal. So there's this great pressure that there should be a deal, and it all falls apart if there is no deal. That is not something that makes me sleep terribly easily at night, because I must say I think some of the problems which they have to deal with are so intractable that it's fairly unlikely that there will be a deal across the board. I think it's slightly less likely than likely that there'll be a deal. That's not necessarily the end of the road, because there will be, I think, a deal on citizens' rights. Whether it's one we like or not, I think there will be a deal. But it won't count because of the conditions that have been attached. And the question was, if there is no deal, so if Britain just crashes out, where does that leave citizens? Sandro Gozzi said to us that he thought, as a matter of honour, people would honour any deal that had been made on citizens' rights alone. I hope he's right about that. He may well be right. Being Italian, he's probably slightly optimistic about these things, because Italians do, as I say, care much more about the situation of their citizens abroad than the British do. I think a lot depends on, if there is a fallout, how bad it is. I still maintain a certain amount of optimism that whatever else happens, there will be a deal on citizens' rights one way or another. And I'll explain in a minute why we need that. Let's look at winners and losers under the arrangement as it is at the moment. The detailed agreement published recently is not totally different from the deal that was announced last December. By and large, you're a winner if you decided, when I'm talking about the British here in Europe, if you decided to move to a particular European country, like Italy, because you wanted to live in Italy, and because you have no need or desire to move anywhere else. If you're in that situation, by and large, things aren't too bad. You'll be able to continue to live here in pretty much the terms that you have so far. Two particular concerns for pensioners from the beginning, or UK pensioners, were these. Would they get their health care? As you know, there's a reciprocal arrangement under which if you're entitled to a UK pension, then the UK pays for your health care in Italy, and vice versa, obviously. That depends upon a reciprocal arrangement, and it was always a concern that the UK government, as you know, the British tabloids have always been concerned about Europeans coming over to rip off the NHS and get the wonderful service that you get for free. Actually, not taking notice of the fact that there are plenty of other countries in Europe with a perfectly good health service, like France, which has a much better health service than Britain. But that was a concern, and so we thought, well, the Tories might do this. The reason why that didn't apply in Europe was because there's European regulation saying that you cannot distinguish the amount of pension you pay or any other benefit you pay by reference to the residence of the person who's entitled to it. That has been preserved, you'll be pleased to hear. So, for pensioners, healthcare and pension increases under the present agreement will stay. Those who move to particular countries can stay, they can work there, they can study, but all within the confines of that country. The other thing which they've got out of it is recognition of qualifications. Many people have a qualification obtained in one EU country which is then recognised in another by a process of the relevant body in the country in question saying, we recognise this qualification so you can do your job in this country. It's reasonably similar to the one you're doing in the country from which you've got the qualification. So, for example, a British qualification as a lawyer is recognised throughout Europe. For the most part, that is going to continue. The one group of people who won't actually have their qualifications recognised are a good example of why everyone hates us lawyers. Solicitors or other lawyers practicing under their home titles. So an Italian avvocato working in London under the title avvocato, a British solicitor working in Germany, will not be allowed to practice at all. They will have to get admitted to the local bar in order to be able to practice. And that is quite a dramatic change and restriction of the rights of people who have probably been working that way for 20 years. Most lawyers, because they have this right under the relevant directive, have worked that way under their home title as long as they've been working in Europe. That is going to stop. And that is completely inconsistent with the EU's general position, which is that your rights to do what you're doing in the country where you are at the moment of Brexit will be preserved. And no good reason has ever been given for it. It's point of principle. I suspect it's because, by and large, British lawyers have been more successful in delivering services across boundaries than the lawyers of other countries, because the British legal profession is pretty effective at that sort of thing. There's made a big effort to do so. That, by and large, is the rules, I think, on the so-called winners. I suppose the other group I should mention are frontier workers. If you live in Italy and are working in, let's say, Switzerland, because at the moment we're just talking about EU countries, but I think whatever is agreed with the EU will apply equally, certainly to the EEA countries, and probably also in Switzerland as well, by extension in the way that usually happened. So, frontier workers, so if you live in one country and work in another, you'll be allowed to continue to do so. The other question I need to raise here is the question of family members. The one issue between Europe and Britain, which Europe really wants and Britain doesn't, is the right to bring future family members to live with them in the country of residence. So, for example, someone who at the moment is not in a relationship but moves abroad, wants to meet someone abroad or meet someone from abroad who they want to marry and bring to live with them in the country, whether it be Britain or an EU27 country. The EU says, yes, that should happen, even if it happens after Brexit. Britain says no. That's an impasse which might be being resolved over this weekend. We don't know. But that's the biggest of the outstanding issues where Europe is being very firm and Britain is equally putting up a wall. Interesting to see how it plays out. Otherwise, you will, if you're within the scope of the agreement, if you're covered, you're one of these people who's basically moved before Brexit, you will have the right to bring other family members to live with you after Brexit if they're an existing member of your family. So one of the concerns that was raised and only got resolved in December was an aging relative. An Italian living in Britain who had an old mum who was getting old and wanted to, and needed care with their family back in Britain. The initial proposal of the British was they shouldn't be allowed to bring them. They've now agreed that. So an existing member of your family will be able to come. The same is true of children, and it will be true also of children who are born in future to an existing relationship. We think, and this is an area of doubt particularly after production of the written agreement in its final form this week, we think the intention is that young people will not get these benefits. So, for example, a child who at the present is dependent, under 21, living in Italy, British child living in Italy, will not be able to go back to the United Kingdom and bring with them as a right a person that they may fall in love with after Brexit. That seems to be where the dividing line is, that you have to be effectively an adult and independent to have these rights. People who are simply entitled to be in the country they're in at the moment by virtue of being a family member probably won't. A bit of a question mark over that because it seems pretty unfair and pretty arbitrary cut-off point that someone of 22 will have a right which somebody of 19 doesn't. Something to look into, could be important for some people. Who are the losers under the deal? The clearest losers are those who need freedom of movement, because the Commission has been absolutely clear, and the EU seems to be backing them and saying that British citizens in Europe will not have free movement after Brexit. It doesn't apply the other way, of course, because EU citizens in the UK have free movement in all the other 27 countries. It's just Britain they have a problem with. And the proposal that we have made is that you have complete reciprocity by giving EU citizens in the UK the right to return indefinitely, so they don't lose their rights by leaving the UK for a period, and giving us freedom of movement. So far in ANPAS, the latest written agreement which the EU has used absolutely excludes any right for us not only to move to other countries, but also, and this is the most extreme version, completely new, to provide services to someone established in another country. Now think of that in practical terms. A British translator who speaks English and Italian, based in Italy, will not be able to provide translation services to a French, German, or Romanian client. They will if that person comes to Italy and says, please you do it, a piece of paper is handed over then and there. But that's not how people work these days. To do that remotely, to do it over the telephone, will not be covered by this agreement. And strictly speaking, people who do that will be in breach of the new rules. Now, having said that, they're going to have a problem enforcing it, which is another reason why it's such a stupid proposal. But this is the EU's current position. Equally, of course, there are people who have made a living moving from one country to another. Some of them are in this room. Others that I've mentioned, Jane and Fiona, have both moved around Europe and needed to do so. IT contractors, another member of the British and Europe Committee, is married to a man who's an IT contractor. He has, together they have lived in Germany, Belgium, Holland, and they're about to move to Spain. Under this agreement, they'll be frozen in the last country they end up in and won't be able to carry on doing that. But that's how IT contractors work. You have a contract for a couple of years from a particular company, and then you move on because that particular job has come to an end. And so all these people in specialist areas who have done great things, both for themselves and for Europe, by providing a service, moving around, taking advantage of the single movement, are to be frozen in the country where they stay. All of us have some problems in this, and I think I'm probably setting out a problem which will be solved, but is there at present. We live in the Schengen area. Not everyone, of course, lives in the Schengen area, because not all the countries subscribe to Schengen, but at the moment we can just drive across the border, provided it's the right border, without too much difficulty. The Schengen Agreement has been reduced to a regulation, and the regulation will not, without amendment, cover the rights of people who are entitled to be in a member state because of the withdrawal agreement yet to be made. So strictly speaking, we will not have the right to move across the border in that way. Quite how they control it, given the right to be controlling the border, is another matter, but strictly speaking, we'll be outside that agreement. Things like that need to be dealt with, and haven't, because they haven't been through. The other problem, which is potentially quite a difficult one, and we don't know how this will play out, is this. Britain's concern from the outset has been to maintain its immigration laws. So they got to do this. Europe originally said no. You've got a perfectly good system of entitlement to reside under European directive. We all live here under that European directive. Let's carry that on. It's worked perfectly well for however many years. British said, no, we have to control our borders, we have to take back control, we have to count the people who come in, and we have to make sure that they're all right to be there. So they came up with a fairly complex set of rules which were to apply to people who were going to be entitled to remain in the country. Very surprisingly, and not until December, the European Union, who consistently opposed this, not only gave in but said, that's a good idea, we'll have some of that as well. So the prospect, and the December agreement set out options. The European country can choose either you carry on with your existing rights, so all of us who have residence card, or the right of permanent residence in Italy, will just carry on as we have without having to do anything about it. Or the option is that countries like Italy can invent a new scheme for registering those of us who have these rights already, and others who may not have gone through the right processes. Now, there's it's not a completely silly decision, because places like France simply haven't used the existing registration system, and they're like Britain in that sense. They do not register the European citizens who come to their country. But in a country like Italy, where it's been done for years, it is really wholly unnecessary. What's the problem? Well, the problem is bureaucracy. The Italian bureaucracy is no better. Some would say it's worse, but certainly it's no better than bureaucracy in other countries. And you will get different decisions in different places. One community will not know the rules correctly, another one will apply a different set of rules. My wife got her certificate of permanent residence. In this way, she went into the comune in Spoleto, spoke to a woman who said, you've got absolutely no right to be here, go away, I'm not going to give you a permit, it doesn't exist. She just talked a lot of nonsense. So Delia went back the next day, looked to see who was on duty. This woman wasn't there, spoke to another very nice lady who said, fine, absolutely, you can have it and come back tomorrow, it'll all be there. That's the Italian way. The German way is to have a set of very, very strict rules, which are applied very, very strictly and completely uniformly, but they also could be quite difficult. People might end up having to produce documents from 20 and 30 years ago to show that they have the right to be in the country at all. And that's the kind of thing that we would like to resist, and one of the things that we have to deal with if this option goes through is with the new Italian government to say, please just leave things as they are. Let us operate under the EU directive, which works perfectly well, so anyone who's got a right of residence or right of soggiorno permanente can continue to exercise that without more ado. Now, hopefully, the new government will have enough other things on its plate to think, oh God, we can't pass yet another law, and won't bother, but who knows? That's the situation, that's the downside of the new arrangement as far as registration is concerned. Doubts. Those are the winners and the losers, by and large. There's lots more detail, but those are by and large the winners and losers under the existing system. Areas of doubt are dual citizens. Everyone's rushing off getting citizenship. It is probably a good idea, but you need to think quite carefully about your own position before you do so, and I'll tell you why. Dual citizens don't necessarily have the best of both worlds. There was a case recently where an EU citizen, moved to the United Kingdom and brought with them their spouse who was from outside Europe. So the spouse had no freedom of movement of rights in their own capacity, but came under EU law as the spouse of an EU citizen exercising free movement of rights. The British said, that person then naturalised and got British citizenship. The British government said, well, you're a British citizen, you're here by virtue of your British citizenship, you're not here by virtue of EU rights, so you can't have your EU rights, and your spouse cannot come to this country unless they can pay, it was £18,600 you have to produce to show that you're able to support yourself. Quite a high sum of money for a lot of people. So they said British law prevails over European law here. The European Court of Justice recently decided that was wrong, and that it would be an interference with freedom of movement rights if people couldn't bring their partners under EU law, even if they happen to be a national of the country in question. Now, that's not spelled out in this new agreement. We're trying to get it spelled out in this agreement, and there must be a reasonable chance of doing that. But there is just a risk, if that doesn't happen, that the EU law will not prevail over citizenship, and people whose citizens' rights are under national law are not as good as their EU rights may not do themselves any favours. It really is too early to say that at the moment, but just think about it before you go along in front of the Syndico and swear undying loyalty to the Italian Republic. The other and a related issue there, which also needs to be dealt with, is returning citizens. A British citizen returning to Britain will only be able to bring with them family members if British immigration law says they, or British citizenship law says that they can, British citizenship and immigration law says they can, after Brexit. Again, a British citizen married to an EU citizen going back to Britain may only be able to do so if they can produce the income that's required. And that may not be possible for very many people. So that's an area where, again, we're pushing to try and get the existing right, which is an EU right, to take your family member with you if you return to the country from which you came. One issue which may be of concern to some of you is voting rights. The EU law gives us at present a right to vote in European Parliament elections and in local elections. European Parliament elections obviously will go because we won't be citizens of Europe. But there was a concern about whether voting rights would remain. The present situation is that both the Commission and the British say no voting. No, British would be quite happy for voting rights to continue. The Commission is saying no. The European Parliament is saying we should continue to have voting rights. Our own view is that that's fairly unlikely to get through. There are some legal issues which might trigger referendums in some of the EU countries if that particular provision was to go through. So we've tended to not push it too hard. Whether people have voting rights in local elections will be a matter for national law. The other thing I should say, I mentioned freedom of movement, and I mentioned that Europe is opposed to us having free movement, and Britain, I didn't mention it, but Britain would quite like it. They've gone for that, but they don't really care very much about it. The people who do care about it are the European Parliament. The European Parliament passed a resolution this week to confirm that we should have our full right of free movement throughout the 27 countries. The European Parliament is the organisation which is probably most committed to European citizenship, and Guy Verhofstadt has always been a great supporter of this view. Hopefully, pressure from that source will prevail and we'll get our freedom of movement. The difficulty is that the sanction the European Parliament has, if they're not happy with the deal, is to say veto, so it becomes a no deal. And really nobody wants that because any deal is better than no deal. So that's a difficult situation at present. I should, it's nothing to do with the Brexit negotiation, just mention votes for life. We've got the sign there, which reminds us all of the way in which people were treated during the referendum. You may or may not know, but the Conservative manifesto promised that the rule depriving British citizens abroad of a vote after 15 years away would be abrogated. They've done nothing about it. A private member's bill was introduced by a Conservative MP, and on 23rd of February, very surprisingly, it got a second reading. It got through the second reading stage, which is quite remarkable. It was opposed rather weakly by a number of Labour MPs. We think on the basis that Labour's always calculated they'll lose if British citizens abroad get the vote. We've tried to convince them that they're wrong about that, because the people who are angriest about the deprivation of a vote are those who are based in Europe, of which there are about 300,000 still within the 15 years still able to vote. And if they were to support the right to vote, it would do them a lot of favours, because most of those people in Europe are very angry with the Tory government for the way in which they've been handling the negotiations so far. But in any event, the bill is still alive, and there is a distinct possibility that it will become law, which would be fantastic. The Tories have promised that it will be law by the next election, and they haven't said anything about a referendum, should there be another one. I think that's all I've got to say. It's been fairly schematic and fairly outlined. I've sort of skated over lots of points of detail, but if anyone would like clarification of any of that, or has any more detailed questions, I'll do what I can to answer them.
Could you just clarify what permanent residence is? Because I've been advised not to go for citizenship in the past because I'm self-employed, and that was a few years ago from the lawyer. But then this issue of permanent residence has come up. I just want to know what it actually is, and how it's different to residence and how it's different to citizenship.
Okay. When you exercise your right of movement, you move to another European country. For the first 3 months, you have an absolute right to be there by just waving your passport around. After 3 months, there is a right to continue to reside in the country, provided that you satisfy certain conditions. And those conditions are that you be working, or that you be a student not capable of maintaining yourself and with health insurance, or you be a person of independent means, capable of maintaining yourself and with health insurance, or you be a family member of any of the above. You have to satisfy those conditions for 5 years to be entitled to reside under European law in the country in question. After 5 years, you have an absolute right without those conditions to live in the country. So if you've resided in the country continuously, you can have, obviously you can go on holiday, and there are the rules about the breaks. But basically, after 5 years, you have a right of permanent residence. You can apply to have that proved, if you like, by the issue of a certificate to say that you have got a right of permanent residence. And when you do so, you will have to prove that you have in the past met those conditions about being self-sufficient or whatever. But that's
What's the procedure for that?
You go to the Comune and you fill in a very simple form. And if the lady who you don't like is the lady, you go and see the other one the next day.
There is one there. Okay, so just go to the Comune.
Yes, that's done through the Comune. Citizenship is different, it's done through the Prefettura and the government, and it's a much more complicated process.
Are we talking about permesso soggiorno?
No. Permesso di soggiorno, as I understand it, doesn't really exist anymore. You have a right of residenza as initially, and then a right of soggiorno permanente that's the language. I think permesso di soggiorno was what you wanted. You needed to have waiver. Or if you're an American.
One I've got stamp permanente is...
Maybe it's the same thing.
Yeah, I think probably.
Yeah.
Depends which province it is.
I mean, mine is evidenced by my carta d'identità. I don't have permanent residence because I haven't been here long enough, but I do have a right of residence, and I've got a piece of paper back at home which confirms that.
So, is this certificado de residencia es even if you put out to Brexit, is what you're saying? Because my certificado de residencia so the national saying I have the right of residence permanente.
Okay.
I did this a few years ago, so maybe.
Well, it should have that effect. I mean, if the deal goes through, you'll have the same right. If Italy opts for the new further procedure, so you have to apply again, you should be entitled to just exchange it for your existing piece of paper. for another piece of paper which says you have the right to be here. The only thing that the new agreement does provide is that criminal checks can be done. You also, at least under the English system, you have to certify I have no convictions. One thing to be totally careful about if you're asked to do this is not to miss out any convictions you might have forgotten about or seem very minor or you think might upset the authorities, because that gives them the right to check you out for trying to deceive them. But that apart, no, that would be the case. If there is no deal, then your rights will depend upon the outcome of a case which is going on in Holland at the moment, which is a case challenging the right of Holland, but effectively all the EU 27 countries, to deprive us of our citizenship rights. Just to tell you what's happening there, the case was brought by a group of British citizens in Holland. It's slightly artificial because actually the Dutch weren't being any nastier than anyone else about this, but it was just a test case. And the aim was to get the judge in Holland to refer the issue to the European Court of Justice to see what, in fact, our citizenship rights are, whether they are inalienable, whether they can be automatically taken away by the country from which we come leaving. The judge made a reference to the European Court, and we were hoping that would go ahead. That was in, I think, February. The Dutch government and the City of Amsterdam appealed, and the hearing of that appeal is going to take place on the 28th of April, and the appeal court will have the right to decide whether that reference should continue. If it does continue, then they will not decide anything about the rights. The matter will go to the European Court of Justice, which is unlikely to consider it before the earliest the autumn, and they're not terribly quick. And the judgment might take a bit longer, but hopefully they will expedite it in all possible ways because it is so important. And by October, we're getting very, very close to Brexit Day, which, just to remind you all, is just over a year away now.
Yes, I have a question of a British citizen who moves back to the UK and has an EU husband or wife. The amount that they have to be earning, I think you said 18,000.
If you haven't got children, it's 18,600 at present.
Yeah. Is that on the British citizen, or does that also include the husband and the wife?
At the moment, the rule is, it used to be just, I think it used to be actually just the person who was being imported, if you like. It now is the couple. You can produce them in between.
Okay, thank you.
I'm pretty sure that's right. Give me an email address and I will confirm that from home.
Thank you very much.
And if you have kids, sorry, just to continue you said it depends on if you have kids.
The figure goes up a bit.
Okay.
I forget the numbers, but for each child that you bring with you, it costs a bit more.
And I have another question while I've got the microphone. I'm a freelance teacher. I teach English and music, and quite often I have to apply to various EU-funded projects to pay for the courses that I'm teaching. So the band. So I wanted to know if, first of all, I'll be able to take part in these EU-funded projects, which, funnily enough, have stipulated that it must be madre lingua inglese. How we going to get around that? And I printed out a page from a band, just to show you that it's kind of to do with also accesso pubblico impiego. So does that mean that I won't be able to apply to any projects that are connected to English teaching for comune, scuola statale, all these kind of things? What happens?
Some of that is going to be EU law, and some of it probably Italian. Is that right? I mean, I don't know the answer to your question. To be frank, I think these are things which are going to be up for grabs because they're about the future relationship. It's not as such something which has been negotiated on so far. The question of your ability or any other madrelingua English person to give a service is covered by the agreement at present, or the negotiations at present. But special rules on the services that can be provided have not been discussed yet. and they're very clear. The EU have been very concerned to see that nobody who's here at present can somehow get the British toe in to the single market after Brexit. And that's why they've been so restrictive in the provision of services and things like that, to the detriment of those of us who are here already.
Because, sorry, just because my grand plan to get around this was to get Italian citizenship, because then I would be an EU citizen applying for EU funding, but then I'm not. But then it says that the person has to be a member of the EU community, but then you've just said that getting Italian citizenship, I'm also possibly putting myself in a difficult situation if we then want to, at a certain point, live in the UK.
Not
so
necessarily,
yes. I feel like you're saying that we have to sort of make a choice now where we want to be for the next 20 years.
I think what I would say is don't rush into an application if it might affect you badly. I'm just trying to think whether it makes any difference. No, it doesn't make any difference at all. If you're a British citizen now, you haven't yet applied for Italian citizenship. If you want to move back after Brexit, the fact that you've got Italian citizenship won't make it more difficult to bring your family with you. It's the fact that you're a British citizen at all, you're born in that country, that creates the problem. So it will be different if we can get better rights in the negotiation, but as things are at present, it doesn't make any difference. You are screwed. I hope that's reassuring.
Anyone have any other questions?
Okay. How will the transition period affect our status?
I think, again, we've got the EU proposals on this, and we've got something from the British proposals on this, but that hasn't been finally negotiated. I suspect not at all. The big issue between the two sides has been what will be the rights of people who move across the channel during the transition period, who haven't moved before. So if you're here already, I think it won't affect it. The EU is fairly adamant that you will retain all your EU citizenship rights, except the right to vote, because you won't be an EU citizen as such. The right to vote, and there are various other things like the right to petition the European Parliament, but on major issues you'll retain all your rights.
Mine's just quickly about our children, because I've got a son 16. So okay, you said people under 21, people who will be able to go to the UK and have the same rights. But how would he be treated in England, in the UK?
Is he British citizen?
He's Italian father and British mother.
What's his citizenship?
Well, he has Italian, obviously, and he has got a British passport. But I don't know whether that means he also has citizenship.
Yeah, it does.
The passport he was born. Okay.
Yeah.
So he might be in a compromised situation like any Brit with dual nationality.
First of all, there's a dual nationality issue, and secondly, being a British citizen, if he wants to marry Italian and take them there after Brexit, he may not be able to. Okay. Better stay in Italy, really, just tell him. Well, why would you?
Any?
Okay, is that all the questions?
Well, I've just got one.
Anyone more?
Okay, it's just a very basic one. I would just like to know, after Brexit, what is going to be the main changes? How is this going to affect us? What's going to be the biggest change?
Well, if there is a deal, and it's something like the deal that's going on at the moment, then the biggest change will be on your right to move around Europe. That will be the biggest single change. And to provide services for someone outside Europe. I mentioned the question of translation, but I think quite a lot of people here are translators. It's quite a common job for British people to have in Italy. Those will be the main effects. If there's no deal, then the sky's the limit. We've always been of the view that mass deportations are fairly unlikely. There is a thing called the Long-Term Residence Directive, which gives third country nationals, let's say people from right outside Europe, certain rights. They're nothing like as good as the rights that we have as European citizens, but that would probably apply. We would have Schengen rights, probably, but it would rather depend on what status we were left with in the country here. It's a big if there is no deal, there's a huge problem for somebody to sort out, which is what is the status of the people who've been living here, given that they don't want to deport them. And it could just be that we're all living here as clandestini, quite openly. It was quite interesting at the committee that I gave evidence at. The chairman of the committee, who is a representative for for Italians living in Europe, he's a European constituency senator. He said, well, of course I was living as a clandestino in Switzerland in the 1980s, so I understand your problems.
Okay, well, I think perhaps we'll bring it to a close there then, is that okay with everybody?
If anyone's got any questions they didn't want to raise in public and would just like to talk to me about, then I'm quite happy to take those as well.
Quick one. Do you think no deal is a small if or a big if?
I think it's a big if. But I think no deal, in the true sense of the word, I think is a big if. I think there will be huge pressure for there to be a citizens' rights deal of some sort if there is no deal across the board. Just because something's got to be done, it's got to be sorted out. And what deal that would be will depend on how ill-tempered everyone is feeling at the end of the negotiation.
Okay, so we'll go into the next room for a glass of wine, and then some people are going for dinner. So if anybody else wants to join us for dinner, can you please let us know? We have about 15 people going up to the Valpolicella restaurant in Corbe. Anyone else who wants to come is very welcome if you could let me know. And I'd like to say thank you so much to Jeremy for coming, and also thank you to Stefano. It's been extremely illuminating, I think, for all of us, and we really, really appreciate all the work that you've done and all the time that you're putting in for us. It's very much appreciated. Thank you.